we are recording. Karen's gonna hit record, or Nancy. So, you know, I'm gonna be on my best behavior today. I do want to recognize we also have members of our Gen Ed committee with us. So far, I can see Judy and Caroline. Thank y'all for being here. And we'll also, I think Judy Gosh may be joining us here in a little bit. So, so they're here to jump in if I leave something out. If you put your question in chat, and I'm about to close the chat, and so because I can't multitask, I can't have it open and do this at the same time. I don't know how y'all feel about that, but it gets me every time. I get a little, oh, what is that? You know. And so I'll close the chat, and if you have questions, you can unmute and interrupt me but it might be that I'll get to that and answer that. So if you want to, I am going to keep this relatively short. Let me start my stopwatch. There we go. I'm going to keep it short enough so that we have plenty of time for some question and answer at the end. So awesome. Yay. Okay, so I've looked at a lot of that information in there. That's good and helpful. Okay, so I'm going to close that chat, and then Nancy will help me with it at the end if we need to check and see for more information. I do want to get officially started. My name's Angel Hughes, and I'm the Assistant Vice President of Academic Affairs for University Parallel, which is a really long title, but they fit it all on my new little cards, and that's awesome. So I started in July, and assessment is one of those things that I'm spending a lot of time focusing on early in this time. Since I work with University Parallel, the assessment focus that I have is University Parallel and general education. And I work closely with Judy Gosh, who gets to work with career program assessment. So I do want to start, before I get too far into this, and thank PACE. They are awesome. And this training was something that came up early last week, and they got it on the books and got people in trainings very, very quickly. And I'm so impressed with how they work. So anyway, that's to get us started. Okay. So, oh good, I see we're filling up there. Okay. So I want to kind of start out with just what I can call my definition of assessment. And I say that I probably got it somewhere a gazillion years ago, or it's morphed from something else. But I think of assessment as a practice of continuous improvement to promote student success. So it's not complicated. You know, I think we tend to complicate it, but it doesn't have to be. You know, we can look at it through a bigger institutional lens that we call institutional effectiveness, that process of continuous improvement that we do to promote student success. And so I think that's important. But for Gen Ed, what it represents is us asking the question, how do we know that students are learning what we say are the outcomes for Gen Ed, or what TBR tells us are the outcomes for Gen Ed? How do we know students are learning those things? And ultimately, how can we adjust teaching and learning to promote student success in those very crucial content areas as part of their education? So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how this kind of happens at Pellissippi. What are some Pellissippi specific issues? And then we'll talk about the process itself. I have all kinds of graphics. And I'm going to refer to the assessment guidebook many times today. You have access to that, and I'm actually going to send an email out, or it might have already gone out. I sent it to the faculty listserv, but you'll get an email with those links again today. And then we'll look at the form. Again, the form is Gen Ed specific, but it's the same categories career program uses, but just in a different format. So to start out, well, there you go. I opened something in Zoom instead of clicking my slides. Okay, there we go. To start out, let's talk about what kind of the categories are here at Pellissippi. We know that we have this career programs side that feeds those AAS degree programs, and they have program specific outcomes that they work toward. And then we have our University Parallel side, and those are for transfer degrees. That's the AA, AS, AST, and AFA. And so those are kind of made up of two areas. Those gen ed components, those core curriculum classes everybody has to have is what we tend to call them. And then those transfer courses or pathways that are in addition. So for instance, in our AST, those are those education classes that students are taking in addition to their gen eds that will prepare them as they transfer. In gen ed, TBR content areas there are 6 of them. They are communication, history, humanities and fine arts, mathematics, natural sciences, and social and behavioral sciences. And so those are the 6 areas of concentration that we look at. Now I want to talk a little bit about why, how, who, right? So why do we assess? Well, a lot of people will tell you it's because we have to satisfy basic requirements for TBR and as part of our accreditation with SAC-COC. SAC-COC is the group that tells us we are a college, an accredited college, and that, for instance, gives us permission to use federal funding and for our students to receive federal financial aid. So it's no little deal that the accreditation is there. So these are the kind of most common why do we assess answers. But I want to tell you that I think there may be more meaningful reasons to assess. In fact, I would contend that these may, well, I don't want to say it trumps that because like I said, that accreditation is no little thing. But I think these are really cool things that we can get from the assessment process. First of all, I think assessment can help you collect meaningful data that helps us understand what and how our students are learning in courses, in disciplines, and for us, for gen ed as a whole. This is what is going to allow us to look at gen ed as a program and say, okay, how do these things connect? If a student, students, because we're looking at them as a whole, as a data set, if students struggle with writing a thesis statement in a Comp 1 class, and they also struggle in a communication studies class, public speaking, what is that telling us? Where's a point of umbrella that we can look at? I think that assessing helps us purposefully adjust our pedagogy to promote student success. Now, I am a huge fan. I taught for 24 years, and I'm a huge fan of going, I don't know, let's try this semester. It helped me survive some pretty dry semesters. But I also think there's a time where we get to purposefully kind of put together what and how we're teaching with the students that we have. And that's what assessment allows us to do. It allows us to track, program, and that's, in our case, that's gen ed, or in our career programs, the whole program, learning, progress, and success over time. And so I think that's kind of an interesting, if you look at reports over time, there can really be some interesting material. And then I think it encourages us to create and promote a culture of continuous improvement. I think that's what higher ed is about anyway. I don't think people come into higher ed either to teach or as a student and go, I hope I don't change or get any better while I'm here. I don't think that makes any sense. I think teaching in higher ed is a natural process of what this calls assessment, but what you can just think of as continuous improvement. All of us have had days where we teach something in class and then we give it to our students to work with and they stink at it. And we're just like, how can they not get this? What am I doing wrong? And so we go and we sit in our office. When I first got to Pellissippi, I got to office in one of the cubicle groups with people outside my discipline. And so, you go plop in your chair and you go, y'all, what happened today? And we all rolled our chairs back out into the hall. And I think it's a really interesting, because then what happens is they go, oh, I got a website on that. Let me send you that. Or did you try this? Or, and that collective analysis really of here's how this went down. And then you go, okay, here's what I'm going to try next time. And you go back in the room next time and you go, okay, let me adjust my teaching so that we can be sure you get this. And then we give it to them again, right? And the goal is that success goes up. It doesn't always. But I think that's the natural tendency of most teaching. And so I don't think assessment is so far off of maybe what people, how people have created it in their heads. So let's talk a little bit about when we assess. Now, I'll give you a hint. This is a process of continuous improvement. So if we were doing an assessment and I wanted to do a formative assessment, I might stop here and go, okay, when do we do assessment, right? Because we want to be sure this is an outcome people understand. It's a continuous process. Now, that means we do assessment all the time. What I need you to understand, though, is that there are different steps in the assessment process. So you got to be careful. It's kind of like running a race, but people may be on a different race than you. So if you look at a different discipline, they may be somewhere else in the assessment cycle. So they may not be collecting data right this second. And so you have to be careful not to let that get to you. But the assessment is the continuous process that we're at all times doing something on that assessment cycle. Then we can ask who. So who's doing the assessment? Well, faculty. Here's what may surprise you though. All faculty, full and part-time. That is part of the expectation of what we're doing as part of our teaching. Assessment is. Now, that doesn't mean part-time teachers are asked to do the analysis and the assessment write-up, the report write-up, that kind of thing. But it does mean that we don't want to just do assessment in full-time sections or in sections that are, those like 3 assessment-minded professors in your department or whatever they are. So we want to be sure that assessment is across the board. I want you to think of it like developing curriculum. We want it to be a faculty-led process. This should be led by faculty. We have a faculty committee. When I talked about our committee members that were here, that's what I was talking about. We have representatives from each of those 6 areas, the TBR categories that I talked about earlier. And they work within the disciplines to help folks with those assessment processes. But just like curriculum development, faculty should be creating these processes. They're the ones that should be creating the assessments, analyzing the data. If you say, this is what the data says in natural sciences, I go, okay, what does that tell us? I'm going to need to ask somebody from natural sciences. And so that's an important part of that. Analyzing it, making those pedagogical interventions, making decisions about what happens next. Faculty are going to understand how to best help students reach those success levels for those TBR goals. So if we talk about when and who, we want to talk about where, or maybe in what classes we should be assessing. So I said earlier, we don't want it to just be in 1 or 2 select sections. So that's the clue when we talk about in what classes or what sections we are doing this assessment in. We want it to be across the board. And traditionally, one of the challenges was being sure that you had assessments in not just your face-to-face classes, but if you had online sections, if you've got dual enrollment sections, if you've got shorter, semester sections, that you're running it in those also. Now we've got 91% of our classes online. So gosh, I hope you're also planning on running it in those online sections. And so, so you get the idea. It shouldn't just be, again, in that select number of courses. We're not just running assessment in those, honor sections or whatever it might be. So you get the idea. So that gives us an idea. That answers some of our questions. Then we can talk about how. This is the full assessment cycle, and I'm going to go through each one of those steps. Y'all, by the way, the screen I'm looking at is over there. So if you're wondering why I do this, I'm going to look at each of these 5 steps individually. But I want to point out this little arrow, if you can see it, this last one that talks about when we finish, we start here at the top and we work our way around. There's no big stop sign. Like, whoo, you're there, kind of thing. And that's this arrow represents the continuous improvement, that there's always another step. And so that's an important part of it that I just wanted to stop there and identify. So let's start with this top. Well, there we go. And talk about our first step, which is to identify and assess the outcomes and collect the data. Okay. That's why this has to be content driven and discipline specific. You know what you need to find out, and you know the best way to find it out. Now, sometimes that needs a discussion. I've just had in the last week, y'all, I have had the best discussions with some of our faculty about how they're going to figure this out. And I don't have all the answers. I'll stop you right here. If you just, call me and be like, hey, I need to know how I should assess this. I'm going to be like, hey, I got like a million questions and we'll figure it out. And so that is how I can be a useful tool. But for a lot of our classes, this is some kind of summative assessment. So we're assessing a capstone project. We're doing some kind of comprehensive exam and pulling some data from that at the end. You could do something more formative throughout the semester and collect data at several points, or pull data from very specific situations. Starting in the spring, a lot of our gen eds kind of started collecting data in bulk on all of those TBR outcomes. It gives us a baseline, and it also gives us what Sachs calls a mature process. One of the things that they're really looking for is for us to, and of course the one I'm familiar with is Comm Studies that I'm most familiar with. If Comm Studies has 7 TBR outcomes, and we say we assess these 7, do you see that 7 there? 7. They want to be sure that we have at some point assessed those 7, not just that we're looking at, I'll look at these 2 and that kind of tells me all I need to know, kind of thing. So we're looking for that mature process. The cool thing about assessment is it doesn't have to be, and this is one of the other kind of that people fear it. It doesn't have to be this big additional process. A lot of great assessment is embedded in things you already do. Our math department does an amazing job embedding assessment questions in their exams. So it's stuff that they want to find out if their students know for the class, but it's also stuff that they can find out. And so they have specific questions linked to certain outcomes, and they can pull that data out and go, there you go. Now we know what we need to know about that outcome. A lot of groups use, for a capstone project, speech or paper, they use a rubric in addition to the grading rubric, a rubric that talks about, here's the assessment measure, and you can, do that bit. Let me talk just a minute about that, why assessment and grades are not the same. They aren't. If you're grading work, that's awesome. I mean, we should be doing that, but it's not the same as doing assessment. And I'm going to use the word extraneous, and I don't want you to think, I think any part of your grading is extraneous, but I think that we grade for things that are extraneous to assessment. We grade for items that we don't need to know about in assessment. And if we don't need to know about it, then the data from that doesn't tell us what we need to know. So for instance, if you said, I had X number of students make an A and a B and a C, and I had 2 zeros, so I'm going to put that in, and I'm going to go, wait, that's not, because we can't assess what we didn't see. So for instance, not turning a paper in, that wouldn't count. Late work, I always counted late work as late. Well, that would affect the grade, but it wouldn't affect the assessment, because none of our outcomes indicate late work being one of the important items. If you're having, in a science class, if you're having them write up a lab report, and any part of that has to do with the mechanics, the grammar, the spelling, the punctuation, well, those aren't anywhere on the natural science list of outcomes. So while it may impact the grade, it shouldn't impact the assessment. So that's why we keep those grades and assessments separately. So your discipline determines how to collect the data. It's going to be done across all sections. And you can sample if you need to, but even the sample needs to be done across all sections. So for instance, if you do sample, we suggest you collect all of the data and then pull appropriately as you would for a regular sample. So I think my computer gets bored with me and it won't change the screen. We collect this data in whatever format we deem necessary, and we got to analyze it. There may be some math involved, but it's more about the statistics. It's about who, we often talk about it in terms of we want 70% of our students to reach competence or mastery or however it is that you're looking at it. But not just, we collect that data, but why? That analysis portion of it is a really important part of it. And that's why content experts know the most about it. A lot of times we'll hone in on one or two of those TBR goals that are maybe the lowest in success rates. Why were they the weakest points? Why were students less successful? And then we can choose some kind of pedagogical intervention to work on that. How can we change our teaching and learning to promote their success? To be clear, pedagogical intervention should be, wait for it, pedagogical. So this is about changing how we teach the class, not about changing the assignment, the syllabus, the calendar, the assessment itself. None of those things would constitute a pedagogical intervention. These are things like what activity, discussion, homework, scaffolding to a major assignment, right? What are some things that we can do about how we change how we teach it that would help them change how they learn it and then promote that success? So we're looking at doing that. And again, just like the assessment piece, we're looking at doing that across sections. Now, that doesn't mean that, well, let me think about how I want to explain that. Let me do this one. Pedagogical intervention does not have to be necessarily the same for every section. You have to do it in every section, but for instance, one teacher may try one thing and another try another. Now, in some disciplines, they keep it the same. They're like, nope, we're doing this activity in every section. Everyone needs to do this thing, right? In some areas, some disciplines, they're doing, okay, these folks are going to try to do it this way, and these folks are going to try to do it this way. We do need to kind of track it because it makes sense. If there was something that was more successful, you would kind of, that's what, we're learning from. That's the idea. And so, some disciplines take to that prescribed version more than others, and it just kind of works better for what they do. The reality is, though, we can't do the same thing and expect different results. So if we're assessing and then we're assessing again, it's a lot like how our in-service speaker, what happens in the dash, right? And so we're looking for that difference that can be tracked. So we run that pedagogical intervention. What are we changing about our teaching? And then we collect the data again, right? We want to collect it in a same or similar way. I've had, some great disciplines that when they created an assessment, they ran it and they go, oh, wait, we think our assessment may not be working the way we want it to. And I'm like, okay, but if you change the assessment and then you assess again, we're now comparing apples to oranges, right? So one of the things we've talked about is adding, instead of just changing the assessment piece, if you have a 15-question comprehensive final piece that you add in, can we make it a 20-question? Because a lot of times they want to ask something that's further up Bloom's taxonomy, for instance. And so those are some of the things that we could do to make that adjustment and still have comparable data, because the whole point is to collect data, make a change, collect data. Okay, what does that tell us? Did student learning increase? Okay, this is an important message about assessment. If the data represents that student learning increased, awesome, hooray, you have a new way to teach something that the data shows us improves student success. Good job. Okay, now, if you do the research, the assessment, and it doesn't show that student success increased, hooray, good job. Now we know it doesn't work. There's not this punitive, like somebody's waiting, for you to pull up assessment that goes, hey, we found out this pedagogical intervention really didn't have that much of an impact. And we're like, no, that's not going to happen. We're like, okay, great. Now we know what works and what doesn't. Let's try to move on and see what does work. And so you've got a lot of different options for helping students find their success. We ask our students to start strong, to stay strong, and to finish strong. I think one of the misconceptions is that failure to increase student success over assessment is somehow, like I said, going to result in some kind of indictment of an entire course or discipline or even a teacher. And you should know that we don't track that. We don't track individual teachers and the results from their sections. We look at disciplines over time, but even then we're looking at faculty designed assessment that just tells us ways that we can help increase learning. And so we're not looking at the other, we're looking at opportunities to understand our students, to align within a program and some of the things that are happening in a program, and improve so that our students can succeed and reach their goals for what they're trying to do. Now, ultimately, you need to close the loop. That's a super common phrase in assessment, and it's kind of like our pretzel here. All the assessment in the world, much like our pretzel may be a salty, carby, tasty version of whatever it is. You know, it may be awesome. And technically it's still a pretzel if the loop isn't closed, but does it really do what it's supposed to do? Well, in the case of assessment, the loop needs to be closed for it to do what it's supposed to do. This may be a better visual for that. I just had to include some carbs somewhere. It's the middle of the afternoon. We probably needed it. So instead we'll look at this one and think of it as in the image is to connect the dots, right? To not just stand in one place or end it right there like, okay, so this is what the data showed us the second time, thanks. But to close that loop in a way that says, okay, what does all of this mean? What does this tell us about teaching this class, or how this class exists inside this whole discipline or inside this program? They're not isolated elements. When you collect data, you analyze it, you change teaching, you collect data. Those aren't things that just happen like it's just one little thing, right? These are all part of that bigger cycle. And so the last real question is, you know, what does that tell us about the bigger cycle? So that closing the loop is a crucial part of the assessment work. Okay, so that gives us the cycle, right? And that first visual that I gave you, that cycle, is in the guidebook if you want to look at the steps again, but it's also addressed throughout the assessment form. I originally had the assessment form and I was pulling it up and looking at it, but instead I just took sections of it and put it here in the PowerPoint so that I could look at it. It's bigger, frankly, is what that enables. And so just a couple of things. We're just going to go through the sections of this so that if it causes something to question, then you can ask. So I hope most of this is self-evident, like the course name and number. You know, I had a great question today about whether or not you can have multiple TBR outcomes. You know what? You absolutely can. And for some of our groups, they looked at all of their gen ed outcomes in the spring. And so you can definitely have more than one of those on a report. There's some other stuff that if they're not the same, you have to separate the reports, but that is something that you can incorporate. And then, well, I talked about, there's the focal area and there's outcomes. And then these Pelicipi student learning outcomes, those are the ones that were created by the people who teach the class. TBR gen ed outcomes were where TBR created them, right? But your student learning outcomes for your course should be mapped to those gen ed outcomes. So for instance, if you're only doing gen ed outcome number 1 and 2, you probably have some specific course outcomes that are pointing straight to those, right? If you're doing all of the gen ed outcomes, it's likely that all of your SLOs are pointing to that as well. So that's what we're looking at for those sections. So the next step is the cycle. And what's interesting is this very much mirrors that circular cycle we were looking at. So for instance, what year did you collect the data the first time? Or what semester? When did you analyze it and decide how you were going to improve? When did you do that pedagogical improvement and collect the data again? And then when did you close that loop by telling us what did that data actually tell you? Okay, so a couple of things about this. There may be some overlap. So for instance, we had disciplines in the spring that collected data, created the assessment and collected the data in the spring and have analyzed the data and decided how they're going to intervene. So I don't know if you'd count that as spring or summer or fall, but they've already done that. So this is spring, this is fall, and then in the fall, they're going to implement the pedagogical intervention and reassess with new data, right? So they'll be able to complete this whole cycle in a year. Traditionally, this was set up to take 4 different semesters. So you can see that, again, the discipline gets to make that decision. It is important to point out, though, that this is, I know it was a circle earlier, but now I'm going to say it's a line. This is a linear process. So it's not like you're going to start here in the 3rd step and then head up to the 1st step. And that, so it's not like you just get to put it together however seems logical kind of thing. You want to follow those steps in order, and then the length of that order is what may be determined differently. So the next section is just have you talk about what's your assessment tool. Are you going to use an exam? Are you going to use a capstone project? If it's an exam, what kinds of questions are you going to have? If it's a capstone project, what's your rubric look like? So go ahead and submit those when you do this so that you've got that piece already. If it's an assignment and you're using a rubric, attach the assignment and the rubric, right? So you've got all kinds of ideas. How are you going to make sure all sections get it? How many students do you anticipate there being? And so, you've got those kinds of questions there. A common target is 70%. That's just kind of, if you think about it, that's how we consider, for most of our, for grades, that would be in the passing range, right? So for assessment, that also would put us in the competency or mastery range. And so we often look for at least 70% of students to, be able to answer the questions right, or to be able to get to a certain point on a rubric. And then you collect that data. What does that tell us? Or tell us what the data says. Now, it can be done in a paragraph, bulleted, or tables. We had some really cool tables submitted last fall, or from last fall, that talked about, that we're able to compare. We looked at all 6 outcomes, and here's what we found out about each one, and some really cool information. But that may not be necessary, especially if you're looking at fewer outcomes. So what percentage of the students displayed mastery? If we're aiming for 70%, where'd we get? Now, it's important to tell you here that if they reach 70% in all your categories, you don't just go, oh, so we're done. They were successful. We're done. That's when you say, okay, so maybe what was the weakest area? Okay, this one's at 72. So this is worthy of our attention, and definitely important that we help students be more successful in that area. And then we analyze the data. What does it tell you? Not just this outcome was the lowest. Why? Why do we think that is? Or what does that tell us about what happens next? Give us some information. That's what that analysis piece is. And then how do we plan to intervene? So what are some specific strategies? Not like we're going to teach that harder, that's not what we're looking for. What are some specific strategies that we're going to identify to work in those weak areas? Are we going to do an activity that every section is going to do? Are we going to ask every teacher to track how they intervene so that we can then look at the numbers and the results? What kind of approach are we looking at here? And so here's the difference that I want you to catch. You're going to plan the intervention and you're going to turn that in. And then after you do the intervention, you want to see a line here almost, right? And I had a great suggestion. Ron Bridges talked about, we could talk about it in terms of pre-intervention, and then the intervention you do, and then this assessment is post-intervention. So the next question is, okay, how did you intervene? And if you're like, I just answered that, you asked me how I was going to intervene, and I told you, okay, I don't know, maybe there is a global pandemic that causes your intervention plan to change a little. Just saying. So for instance, if in the spring, you had planned to do small group discussions in class, blah, blah, blah. Okay, turned out we weren't in class in April. So how did it change? Did we put them in Brightspace? Did we put them in groups? Did we do it in Zoom? So it may be that the pedagogical intervention changed. If you had different people doing different things, this is your shot to tell us, well, we had about half of our, this many of our sections ran this kind of intervention. And these groups tried that, this is your chance to tell us this is kind of how this all unfolded. And then tell us the new assessment data. I'm gonna put a cough drop in. It's harder to talk, but my throat gets dry. Then this is the new assessment data. Okay, so we did the intervention, we assess again. What does that tell us? So here's the important data piece. Well, there's two really. Here's the new assessment data, and then what changed? How much did student success increase? Or did it increase? Did it go down? Which happens, y'all. And so what are we seeing about how the data changed from pre-intervention to post-intervention? And that's really what assessment is asking us. And when you get this form to completion, that's the point. And then this last section is closing the loop. What does this tell us about our overall strategies for teaching in this course or this discipline or this program? What does it tell us about how we can improve overall? Do we need to go at it again because it didn't make it any better? What is the impact? Now, as you can see, each one of these kind of indicates the different points at which you'll turn in a report. So for instance, disciplines that started in the spring, they collected data and they've decided a pedagogical intervention. This is the point at which they're going to turn in a report. In Gen Ed, it's on August 28th. And so that gives you some idea, kind of each of those sections is a little bit of a stopping point, right? Okay, so that's all of that great information. This page is actually, I'm like, where's my escape button? This is and I embedded the link in it. This is the guidebook, and there we go, click out of it so that I can, oh man. Oh, every time I go up there to click it, the Zoom affects me and it won't let me do it. So instead, I'll do it this way. There we go. So the guidebook is something that we put together. I tell you what, they showed me how to do OneNote for promotion and tenure, and I got all kinds of excited about it. So this will get us there. It will just take a little bit longer. So the guidebook is just a OneNote, and it's got these different sections and different categories. Maybe it'll get us there. There we go. And it's meant to be a source. A couple of things you need to know. It is a living document. One of the things that excited me about putting it in OneNote was that we can change it. We can update it. We can add more stuff to it. Oh my gosh, it is the never-ending story. So it's going to be available. It has all the information, not all of it. It's gaining more information. But for instance, a lot of the stuff that we talked about today is available in the guidebook. So it's coming, I promise. The circular graphic that we looked at is there. Well, goodness, y'all. It's taken it very long. Let's see what happens if I just do this. My whole interweb is super slow right now. Okay, so you get the idea that this guidebook is going to lead you through a bunch of stuff. We have a couple of very useful, I'm excited about, resources. There are some links to SACs and TBR information that could be useful. Our librarians, led by Allison Scrippa, who's on our committee, put together a whole list of resources that are available through our library. And so, heck, these links, they'll go right to it and they'll get you the information, all kinds of cool things that you might want to know. Karen Sorensen and our PACE group put together a list of archived presentations or, professor newsletters. You get the idea. And then I've even started getting discipline-specific resources. These are articles about, the one I have is about how anthropology, go Judy Sickler, how anthropology does assessment in higher ed. So that is a super cool way to think about that. And then we've got we're growing examples. So for instance, this is a rubric that we used in Comm Study, that they still use in Comm Studies with their capstone project. And then these are some exemplary reports that we've gotten over the last couple of semesters. Math was cool. He took out they had their test questions in there, and she took those out so that we could make these available to you. And I can't remember which. One of them is mid-cycle and the other one is complete cycle. So those may be of use to you. So that's all the good stuff that I have. I'm going to open there. Oh, good. Oh, thank you. Karen put up the guidebook for anybody that hasn't seen it or have access to it yet. Thank you, Karen. I appreciate that. So that's the process. That's what we're looking at, and that's how that kind of brings all of this together. So what kinds of questions can I answer for you? What are some things that will help you in process this in any way, or kind of help you think through how your discipline is doing assessment? You got to unmute your mic, y'all. Or you can put it in the chat. I opened the chat up so I can finally follow what we have going in there. Oop, there we go.
Hi, Angela. I have a question.
Sure. Tell me who's talking. It doesn't tell me right off the bat.
Sure. This is Rebecca Glad.
Hi, Rebecca.
Yeah. How are you?
I'm good. I'm like, oh, look, it's humans. Okay.
Yes. So I'm from, natural sciences,
Yes.
and you've heard a lot from us. I'm new to this a bit. So if we are completing, we have all 5 outcomes to do, and they're at different stages, because for us, we cannot get them all on something nice like a final exam.
I know, right? They're not just.
No, they are everywhere. So do I complete that form for all 5, and it's just going to be a much lengthier form, kind of explaining it all because they're at different stages?
Okay, so that's that's a really interesting question. I would tell you that if you're at different stages in the cycle, then you're going to complete different forms.
Okay, so if we are doing intervention and assessment on 2, like if we're doing one item that hits 2 outcomes and we're at intervention and reassessment, we could do a form for that. But if we are closing the cycle on something else for the other 3, that would be a separate form.
Yes, that way it just keeps it from getting muddied up.
No, that's fine by me.
Yeah, right. Otherwise, it's like first here and then here. Also follow this arrow.
Yeah, it makes your head spin. Okay.
Yes, and so one of the things the assessment committee, the Gen Ed committee, I should say, looked at reports in the spring and just kind of picked them apart a little bit, because part of what we need to recognize is that in Gen Ed in particular, changing to this form, kind of making the adjustments that we're making, y'all have to understand the assessment process, it's a meta assessment process. We are continuously improving our process also. So I know people are like, as long as it never changes again, I'll be fine. And I'm like, oh, about that, because improvement requires change. So one of the things we did in the spring was that the committee looked at all of these great reports that got turned in, and they were able to glean some ideas about the assessment process itself. And part of that was, if you're on a different, if you have different outcomes in different places in the cycle, we want to do different reports for that. If you're using a different tool, right? So if you're looking at outcome 1 with an exam, but you're looking at outcome 2 with a project, we want to use different reports, because that's going to tell us kind of 2 different data pieces. So we're really looking for how we can collect data pieces. So does that help some?
That helps a lot. And that actually is, I know it sounds like more work, but it's easier to dice it out that way, even on my end. So thank you.
No, you're welcome. And I think sometimes that makes it easier to kind of even divide the work out, right? So it's like, hey, I'll take outcome 1 and 2. You've got 3 and 4, and
Right.
and it can, and not just the collecting of the data, but the leading of that. So I'm looking at your question. Christy, I'll come back to that question a little bit. Caroline says, each class needs a separate form. Oh, that's a good point, Caroline. Yes, even if they're on the same outcome. So for instance, one of the things we also learned was that different courses, different separate courses need separate reports, even if they're like a part 1 and 2. And MBS has a bunch of those. And so even if you've got, and our histories, our arts, Caroline was one of our groups, that we would look at the reports and, it's like in art 1, this outcome was the lowest, but in art 2, it was this one, and we went, okay. And so those were kind of the points that muddied it up. So thank you, Caroline. I'm glad you included that. Ron says each experiment, I don't know if I like that experiment, but okay, each experiment should have one variable. Well, it depends on how you're defining variable. If you're talking about looking at those different outcomes, I'm okay with doing that. And I'm even okay with having different pedagogical interventions. And so, but you're right, the more things we change, the less reliable the data becomes. So we want to think about it that way. Caroline asked, do you have that chart, the flow chart? I don't know if I put that in the assessment guidebook. So we do need to put that in there. I think I have it somewhere, but if you have it, will you send it to me? Caroline made a great chart that was, what do you call those? You're gonna have to turn your mic on and talk to me, Caroline. I always think of it like an if-then flow chart, right? So do I need 2 reports? Well, is it 2 different classes? Yes. No, it's 1 class. So that's a good point. If you'll send that to me, I'll be sure and get it in there. So if you are, oh, I'm looking at Rebecca's, do we include future dates on the form? Yeah, let's go ahead and plan this out. I saw one just the other day. Oh, thanks, Caroline. I'm going to go ahead and I'm afraid to punch download on that because my computer's running so slow right now. I'm like, I'm just going to wait.
Yeah, all that I'll say very quickly about that. This is Caroline. Yeah. This just helps you kind of understand what chart needs to be used. So we just developed this to very simply, in most cases, it's always better to imagine that you're separating it out. And for most of us, that means if you have 1 class, essentially every class gets a form and every stage of the cycle gets a form. So, and you kind of always want to err on the side of you're potentially turning in more forms than not turning in forms. So it's just a flow chart.
And really, it's about pulling it apart, right? Like Rebecca discussed. So it's about, what are we getting to some meaningful, usable data? If you're just like, here's all the numbers we could find, then that's probably not going to help us really figure out what's going on.
Absolutely. And you can include future dates on the form. And I agree with Angel. I think certainly, you're going to anticipate just that it's your working form. One way we'd like to describe it in the committee is sort of how we work on our progressive tenure portfolio. Like you may have been suggested when you were first hired to save it to your desktop, and every time you do something, add something to it. Like this is a document that you're going to turn into us, but hopefully for faculty authors, you have it on your desktop. Every time something comes in, you add to that and you may just edit it from there. So certainly you can work ahead as much as makes sense, but it is essentially a form that just lives with you for each step of the cycle.
And I love that point. And I think about, again, when we work with students, we ask students to do that with work, right? That it's not, that it's always this kind of work in progress until it's complete. And so one of the best suggestions I've made for students before is, you might write notes in class, but then go home and type those up for this is what I really want this to help me remember later. And so it's kind of that same piece, after you have a meeting with faculty or you get a bunch of data in, put it in there ugly if you have to, and then figure out how to make it what we want to report, and this is how this data became meaningful for us. So I think that's a good point. So these were the Gen Ed reports, and that's what Judy was going to look for a date on career programs. So so she's got a date for that. The meeting for them is September 14th. So, but for Gen Ed, the date for these is August. I almost said October. Don't get all excited. Is August 28th. And so that's the end of this week. But if you have questions before then, you can definitely find me in a Teams meeting. And by find me, I mean you send me an email. Be like, hey, you got a minute for a Teams meeting? And like tomorrow afternoon, I know I'm booked all afternoon, but there's probably some time in the morning or in the early evening that I can just, it works so great to just open up your document and be like, hey, that works really well. Or send it to me by email. Think about how we work with students, how they're like, tell me what you think of this. And, I'll pick at it. I'll go, oh, this is great, but this could also, and maybe. The other thing you can do is we have this great Gen Ed committee. I am so proud of these folks, the work, the changes and improvements that have been made in the assessment process. And just like this reporting, the concept of we need to, think through how we're having people do these forms. This committee's worked really hard on that. And so there is likely, and in fact, I know there is because we worked on that this summer, there is a representative on the committee from your discipline, one of those 6 TBR categories. And so run it by them, get some peer feedback. They don't have to know, I don't know all the answers, and they don't have to know all the answers. I have discovered working in assessment that questions are our greatest asset. And so just, I don't know, how are you going to do this? How are you going to find that out? What is it going to tell you, And so those questions can be really helpful in just kind of walking through that process. So what else can I answer for you, or what other thoughts does this bring? It may not be that you have a question, but it makes you go, oh, okay, this does make me think. I got some emails after the Friday training that were really, they showed me this is a really intuitive process, because when people thought through it, they were like, oh, but this, and that can get really exciting. So do we have anything else we need to ask or mention today? All right, if the chat is quiet and the mics are mute, that means we must be done. Hey, I appreciate y'all. I want to recognize that this is the first week of class, and this is busy, and this is new, and you developed a class and you're teaching it online, or you're masking up and doing the screening to go on campus. And so I really appreciate you making time to do this today. Let me know if you have any questions or what your thoughts are later after you stew on it a little while. And if there's something else I can help you with, let me know. All right. Hey, y'all have a great day. Thank you.